Hi again and very welcome to the chapter about the king move. This is one of my favorite topics. I actually wrote an article about it on chess.com and I also covered it in my book Mastering Chess Strategy in the chapter about prophylaxis. And it's actually about a prophylactic idea. With the king move, I'm referring to moving our king in advance. When it's not checked, we're moving it in advance before it's checked, so that once the opponent carries out the move which was supposedly going to check the king, this will give us some additional possibility, because there is some kind of flexibility gain when we move the king in advance. If I can explain this without the board, I would say that we move our king in advance so that we wait for them to show their cards. Depending on their next move, we can do different things because they have already played out their move. All right? I think with our next example, everything that I was saying here will become crystal clear. Let's have a look. In our first example, we have with white pieces Lenderman and playing black Christopher Yu. You can see that white is 2 pawns up, but black is having some attacking chances here. With black to play, it would actually be made in 2 moves, right? That would be queen h6 and queen h1. So white needs to do something about this threat, and as you can see, it's very difficult for them to control this square on h6. It's basically impossible to do it. The only way to do it would be by playing queen a6, but that would be a bad move because black would then trade off the queen and bring the rook to the 6th rank, right? They could take and they could bring the rook, and you can see that now the rook is coming to h6, and yeah, big problems for white because they will have to play something like, yeah, we can play this out if you like, something like this, and you can see for yourself that black will then play g4, so total disaster. I'm convinced that Lenderman, it didn't even cross his mind to play something like this because he saw, of course, that here in the initial position there was a much simpler move at his disposal. Of course, you got it. Queen h6 is coming up, so we should play king g1. Very, very simple. However, I want you to closely notice the effect of this move, because now that we play king g1, if they go queen h6, it's not with check anymore, which means that we can base our move on theirs. In this case, concretely speaking, the queen left the defense of the e5 pawn, so we would, of course, take on e5, and we are basically mating them now, as you can see, or at least we are winning the endgame. If they put the queen on g7, we could just trade. So this would be very bad for black. And why did this happen? Well, because we moved our king in advance. Here it's an extremely obvious case because there is not so much else that we can do. But the same kind of thinking applies to many other situations which involve more pieces and so on than here. But anyway, let's have a look here. Lenderman played king g1. You couldn't play queen h6 due to the pawn hanging on e5, thanks to the greater flexibility obtained by white by means of this prophylactic king move. In the game, black played g4, like a useful move to protect the bishop on f3, and by now it's already time for white to go for the attack. So here Lenderman played the move rook d5. So as we can see here at this point, white is attacking the pawn on e5. You might ask yourself, what happens then if now black goes queen h6? Now we cannot take the pawn on e5 anymore. Well, it turns out that white can go for their own attack. Now the queen left also the defense of the d8 square, so you got it, of course. We will play here rook d8, and after rook takes, queen takes. This is actually going to end with mate. We will mate them here after king g7. And we should just bring the queen a little closer. Queen g8, king f6, queen f7, king g5, and queen f5. Yeah, that's the way it would end in this case. So black cannot go for the attack. They have to play something more solid, and that's what happened in the game. You played rook e8. But now, again, we should be careful because there is the threat of queen h6 coming up. So now, at last, what Lenderman does is he prevents this move. He controls that square. We talked about that in the very beginning. Controlling specific squares is very important in the defensive battle. So queen d2, very good move. We take control of the c8, c1, h6 diagonal, and also we get ready to play something like rook d6, very nasty for black because, as you can see, also their king is a bit exposed in this position. Black tried bishop takes e4, and white duly played rook d6. After queen g7, it was possible to play this move with an attack, but Lendelman proceeded in very technical fashion. He simply played rook d8 because he knew that black would have big difficulties in the endgame. So what happened here was black played bishop c6, rook takes e8, bishop takes e8, and queen d8. Complete nightmare for black. There is no attack anymore. Their king is weak, and also white has an extra pawn. And we're talking about a very strong passed pawn, so white went on to win. Not a very difficult example, but it's important to have this idea in mind. Retreating the king in advance, it can bring us many benefits. It's perhaps, you could say, not that natural. You would say we will only move the king when it's checked, but that's a wrong way of thinking, because very often, yeah, chess is a tricky game. You would say, let's not spend the move on moving the king, let's move some other piece and create more activity and so on. But chess is tricky. It also has to do with what our opponent can do. So if we play out our moves in advance, like king g1 here, it's also more tricky for them because we keep all doors open, so to speak. All right, let's take a more complex example where actually black in this case failed to use this idea, and for that reason they lost the game. It's a game where white is Suarez and playing black is Mirzoev. You can see that it's a very complex position. White is I was going to say they're exchange down, but they have two pawns actually. But we can see that black has a very strong passed pawn on the e-file. So in any endgame, probably black will have good chances, but we're in the middle game, and there is a concrete threat. You have, of course, noticed that white would like to play here rook g7. So the question is, how can we possibly deal with this threat? Should we prevent it, or should we let them play it out, but with less effect than supposedly they would have? So this is the typical, you could say, clash between restricting the opponent or taking prophylactic measures. Restricting in the sense that we don't let them do what they would like to do, and prophylaxis, we let them carry out their idea, but with less effect. So that's the big question here. So let's have a look at black's possibilities. We could, of course, prevent rook g7 by putting something on the 7th rank, but rook h7 would have the problem. It's an unexpected problem, because if you look at it at first sight, it looks like it's okay. The problem is that you and me, we are probably looking a little at this side of the board, right? But there is a way in which white can pick up this rook. So how do you think they could do that? Aha, we have to move away our vision from this side of the board and look at the whole board. And then we notice this move, rook c1. Very unexpected, but what's going on here is that after trading rooks, after king b8, rook takes c8, king takes c8, white is just in time to play queen g8 and picking up the rook next turn. So the importance of looking at the whole board. We could do other things, of course, in this position. Which was the other move I was thinking about? Queen c6. You could play that, of course. You're trading queens. And in this way, we avoid any dangers on b7 and so on. The bad thing about this is that it lets white take the pawn. So after, I think you take first, or you take first. Yeah, maybe you take here first. You have this extra option with knight e7 check. If they take with the king, they take with the pawn. And now I think we can first activate our rook g7 check, and in the next move we will take the pawn. So maybe it's not that bad for black, but black would like to see if they can go for more. So let's go back to the initial position. In the game, unfortunately, black opted for a counterattack. They played in the game e2. It's easy to understand what black had in mind, because after rook g7, black said, I'm just about to queen, like in the game, if you remember Christiansen Lobron, where Lobron sacked the queen on f6, right? And later on, where did he sack the queen? Well, I hope you remember it. I don't remember it completely. I just remember that white was about to mate black with the queen here, and the rook was coming there. And then he sacked somewhere, and later on he queened on this side. Yeah, never mind. The same mindset here. White is saying, all right, black is saying, I'll give up my queen, and I will then bring in a new queen. However, you can imagine what happened, right? After queen g7, of course, white delivered mate. So that was a big tragedy what occurred in this game. So black simply misunderstood the threat here. The threat was not only to play rook g7 and mate on b7, the threat was actually also to deflect black's queen from the d6 square, so that white could deliver mate on d6. So now we have seen a few moves which don't work out that well, and we have now come to the right choice. Since this is the chapter about the king move, of course, you already know which is the right move. Aha, we can play here, we should play here, king b8. So a few things can be singled out here. One, when you play king b8, you open up the c file for the rook. We didn't have this possibility before. Two, you should notice that if rook g7 comes, it's not carried out with check anymore, which gives us greater flexibility. And actually, these two observations, they kind of hang together. So let's have a look here at what could happen. White could, of course, take the pawn on e3. We would take on f4, and black would be playing for a win here. Material is about equal, but by now black's king is much safer. We could put the rook on c7 if necessary, for example, rook g7, rook c7, and we would defend our king rather well. This kind of open game is not exactly what a knight wants when fighting against an enemy rook. So if you look at the more critical move, it would be rook g7. Please notice that sometimes the most critical move for the human, it's not objectively the best move, according to the computer, for example. The computer will prefer, in this position, knight takes e3. But for a human, it's essential to look into the most critical move, even if it's not supported by the computer. I hope you see what I mean. A move can be inferior to another one, but it can be more critical in human eyes because the difficulty of the reply can be greater than in the case of the simple move. If somebody plays knight takes e3, anyone can understand that we should take this pawn, for example. But here it's not that evident how to continue with black after rook g7. So let's have a look. We should go for our counterattack. We can start here with rook c1, the queen a1 should also work, but I would prefer this move rook c1 because our queen was already active. It's tying one of your white's pieces to the defense of another one. So let's start with the rook king g2, and now I would use the queen to give check so that we can keep this check also in the pocket. At this point, white will be very careful about where to go with the king. If the king goes this way, we're happy to bring in our other rook to the battle, king g4. Unfortunately for white, black has a good check here. Yeah, which check would you deliver here with black? Of course, queen e2, so that we keep track of the rook. And then we can bring the other rook to g1, now that our rook is not hanging anymore. So after queen b2, white will have to play instead king f3. Here you have a choice. Should we give check with a rook or with a queen? What do you think? Would you give check like this, or would you give check like that? Speaking of logic, which would be the best choice? Aha, the queen is actually more active than the rook. The queen is targeting the rook on g7 in some variations. So we should keep the queen where it is right now, in a very nice place, and we should use the rook instead, which is not doing too many things. So we should give this check. The reason is, one of the reasons is that if white goes this way, if black now gives check on g2, we could play here knight g3. Aha, I think that's the difference, right? Well, if you, after rook f1, no, I think I got it right. I got it wrong, no? Yeah, I think I mixed it up. If we play queen f2, yeah, then white will play king g4, and they can put a knight on g3. Yeah, that's what I was trying to say, but I messed it up. Yeah, so queen f2 is less flexible, or less powerful, you could say, because white gets a chance to put the knight on g3, and as you can see, the queen doesn't take the rook anymore. So that's the reason why we should start with rook f1. So now if the king goes that way, we will play rook g1. Yeah, sorry, I need to drink another cup of coffee. Rook g1, of course, and now we will take on g7 because we have the queen still controlling that rook. So yeah, king f3, rook f1 check. White will have to go to the middle instead. And as you can see here, we should include our other rook in the attack. We don't have any other checks. There is only one check left, but it's a good check, rook e8, because now white doesn't have any good square for the king, no square for the king. They will have to interpose, for example, with rook e7, and then we can deliver this move, queen g2 check. As you can see, very precise variation, but it's important to be precise in this kind of delicate battle. You can see black's point here. Now we are definitely going to trade off the queens, then we will take the rook, and in the end we will queen our pawn. For example, if king here, we can start by taking on d5, king takes d5, rook takes e7, knight takes e7, and e2, something like that. Never mind, these are small details that you can work out on the way, so to speak. The important thing here, I think, is to see the initial position where the grandmaster actually made a terrible mistake and allowed white to mate them with e2. Terrible mistake, rook g7, and black was mated. But if we use our involved idea here, the king move, the prophylactic king move, king b8, things will be perfectly fine for black. They will be better here. No matter how white reacts in the first place, we should notice that the king is definitely much safer than it was before, and white's king is also a bit exposed in this kind of open position. All right, let's take a more complex example. This one again highlights the importance of flexibility. In this example, it's a game between Diego Flores with the white pieces and Peralta playing black. Let's see if we can understand this. Material is about equal. Well, white has a queen for a rook and a bishop, but there are some features of this position which are not very pleasant for white. Mainly it has to do with their king. You can see that white's king is exposed. This bishop is very annoying, and also the other bishop is coming. You can also see that black's pieces are all very active, and we can in fact outline here one important idea for black. At some point they would like to play e4. This would be very interesting for black if they could manage to play that. For example, if white takes with a pawn, that would mean almost instant defeat, because in that case black would give check and then bring the knight to g4. You can see that f2 is becoming an issue in that case. So if e4, white will almost always like to take with a knight instead. They would like to keep the f-file closed. But still there are other dangers for white here. Yeah, bishop c5 is coming. That can be very annoying for white. Maybe black can later on try to invade on this square somehow, if they can play bishop c5 and maybe double the rooks or something like that. Yeah, many things can happen in this position. I even saw there was something like this, and then you could bring the bishop to b7 also. Yeah, many things that black can consider in this position. So what white needs to do here, they need to find a way to keep also their defensive ideas in place. So for example, we should not move the knight. If we move the knight, if you say, oh, I don't want to allow bishop c5, if I go knight a4, I lose some flexibility now. I don't have the knight in the center anymore. So black would hurry to play here e4, what we just talked about. As you can see, this is now very troublesome for white, because if you take, you have this situation that we talked about, bishop c5. I was going to say, but that cannot be right, no, because they will take it. Yeah, you should play knight g4 instead. This is much stronger, and you can see that the bishop will go that way. Aha, this is what's going to happen here. The bishop can come this way. The rook is trying to get to f2 at some point. White would definitely not be able to play bishop c1 here, I think, right? If they play bishop c1, they lose control of the last rank. Yeah, what would that mean? Interesting. Maybe black would just play something like that, I think. That seems like a good move, right? So we are threatening bishop d4, we're hitting the rook also. And I mean, yeah, you can see for yourself, something like this would just be disastrous for white. Yeah, black's pieces are very strong in this case. So knight a4 would have the problem that we let them play e4, opening up the game. Now that white's knight left the center, white cannot take back in the way they wanted. On the other hand, in the game, Diego Flores played bishop c1. Perfectly understandable move, trying to bring the bishop to e3 in case black gives check. But the problem with this move, on the other hand, is that white loses control for the moment, I mean, of the first rank. And that's something that Peralta exploited in the game. He played the same move here, e4, that we talked about before. Now there is a different connotation of this move. There is a different meaning of this move, because now if white takes on e4, I think there are some problems coming up on the first rank, right? If queen takes e4, I think there is something with rook d1 coming up here, or is that so? Yeah, I'm struggling to remember this. Bishop c5 first, I think, and then we play rook d1. This would be disastrous for white. This, I mean, king h1, rook d1. And if you interpose, well, as you can see, there is a tactical motive on the e-file. Black would play something like rook. Let's see here, we should use this rook probably. Yeah, this rook, so that they cannot give check. And as you can see, white will lose material here no matter how they react. So let's see if I can find what happened in the game. He played here bishop c1. As we said, e4 came, exploiting the situation with the weak first rank. What did white play in the game? Bishop f4, trying to block black on the f-file. After bishop c5, king h1, it's interesting that you and me, we are looking mainly at this side of the board, but Peralta looked at the whole board and he noticed this nice move, bishop d4. So I think the point is that we would like to deflect white's rook from the first rank. So rook c1 to safeguard the knight, e takes f3 was played, and knight g4. Very nice. Suddenly knight f2 is coming up. White had to play knight e4 and black played rook e8. Yeah, beautiful picture. It seems to me a little like Paul Morphy. What black is doing here, using the pieces in a perfect way. You can see that rook takes e4 and knight f2 is the big threat. And I don't think there was any way for white to defend against this. Flores tried knight g5, but after knight f2, he sacrificed, but he ended up queen takes f2, bishop takes f2, knight takes h3. He ended up with big material disadvantage. I think black could play something like bishop b3 here, simply simplifying to an endgame with an extra exchange. And obviously, if you play something like king g1 here, I think you're getting mated, right? We could play something like knight d1 if I'm not mistaken, and then after king h1, since the rook is not touching the e1 square anymore, we would play rook e1. So why did this happen? Well, because white played out their cards, so to speak. They played bishop c1, which allowed black to push e4 and later on exploit white's weakness on the first rank. So having said that, both knight a4 and bishop c1, natural moves, both of them fail. By now, of course, you know which is the right move. Aha, we should play here the move king h1, because now we keep all our options open. If black plays e4, now you already know what we will play, of course. Yeah, we will take with a knight, so that we keep the f-file closed. Knight takes, queen takes. It's still a little scary, I must admit, for white, but it's much better than what we saw before. Black would love to somehow swing over the bishop to this side, but it's not really going to happen, I think. I think I looked at something like that, right? Bishop c5. Black would like to play now rook d2 and bishop g2. Very careful with that. White could play bishop c3, covering this square. And here we have that bishop maneuver. Yeah, exactly. Here it was. Bishop c8 is what I looked at. Trying to play rook e8 and put the bishop on b7. Some kind of beautiful mate with two bishops. But white still has chances here. Rook f1, overprotection of the f3 pawn. Rook fe8, queen f4. What is white up to here? Well, they would like to start their own attack, I think. At some point, they would like to hit the pawn on g7. Black could try something like rook d3. And now white could play this surprising move, bishop takes g7. Yeah, this is not something that you can easily visualize at the board, but it's good to see this picture. Now, bishop takes, so that if king takes, we would play queen g5. And it seems as if white is close to achieving a perpetual here, if I'm not mistaken, that we will have something like this. And also black's rook might sometimes be in there, so black should be a little careful also in that sense. Yeah, this would be a better option for white for sure. King h1, flexible move. We avoid the move bishop c5 with check. We saw that if e4, we will take with the knight. Now, if they play bishop c5, this move doesn't come with check. And now we can play our move knight a4. Please notice what we're doing here. We're playing knight a4 only when we're actually about to take the bishop on c5. Now, this is the right moment. They played out their card and we can reply in the right fashion. So let's see here. We have a concrete variation here. e4. Black is trying to break through on the dark squares. You can see on the right square, something like this and that would be their plan here. But white is fast also. Knight takes e5, e takes f3, queen takes f3. And if black just takes back on c5, we could simplify the position here. Bishop takes f6, rook takes f6, and queen h5. Very important move, so that black's bishop leaves the building before black gets a chance to play rook f8 and rook f1. So white would be okay here. On the other hand, after queen takes f3, black could play knight g4 instead. Wow, black's attack, it seems it's never losing its charm. It's difficult here for white to defend, but we can actually use a counter threat to win an important tempo before we're getting killed. Aha, queen c3, we're playing for mate. It's a little my game, like my game against Hallmark, perhaps in the introduction. We win this tempo, and then we can bring back, after rook f7, we can bring back the knight. Right now, white is material up. They have a queen for a rook, but you can see that by means of rook df8, black is ready to mate us. So again, very scary situation. Queen d3, we will have to get ready to sacrifice, give back the material here. After rook f1, before white goes king g1, black hurries to get back the material. Rook f1, rook takes, queen takes, bishop takes, and we should play something like knight e2 to safeguard this pawn. In the end, after all these tremendous complications, we have ended up in a balanced endgame. Yeah, it's going to be a draw most probably this game, because we can also put some pressure on their queen side. So what was this long and complex example about? Well, seeing through a little the opponent's ideas, we saw the idea of maybe pushing e4 at some moment, maybe playing bishop c5. At the same time, keep some of our ideas flexible. So we don't want to commit knight a4, we don't want to commit bishop c1, because bishop c1 would lose control of the first rank, and knight a4 would make e4 stronger, since we cannot take back with a knight as we wanted. So for that reason, it's actually best to play the move that we will have to play probably anyway. I mean, moving the king to h1. All right, let's look at something a bit simpler. I wanted to tell you also that we can, of course, use this idea also when we are attacking. It's also available when we are attacking. Here you have an example in this game between with the white pieces Kostenko playing black Horoshev. You can see that white is a piece up, and they're also playing for an attack. Black's king is weak. However, as you can see, there is also an issue with double threat here. Black is threatening to take the knight, and black is also threatening to play queen d2 check. So what do you think? How should we handle these two threats? Is there a way to prevent both of them, or would we have to allow one of them? What do you think? Or allow both of them? That's right. Since we know in which chapter we are right now, white's move comes very natural. Kostenko played here the move king g1. Very clever move, because he knew that now black has to show his cards. If black takes the knight on f5, it doesn't come with check, which means that now we can go for an attack. We play here queen a6. We will come back to this very soon. I just wanted to show you that if you start instead with queen a6, if we start with this move, then we are showing our cards. After king b8, a takes b6, white is about to mate black, but black would have no reason to take the knight. That would be silly, because the king would just go back. Now black would execute the other threat that they had, queen d2. Not so much for taking the rook, of course, because then black is mated. Instead, black can look for a perpetual here, king f3, because if the king goes down, obviously, we could then take the rook on c1. So the king would go up, and we would give check again, and this would probably lead to a perpetual. You can see that it's even a bit dangerous for white to go up. Then we could give check and take on f5, right? So this would lead to a perpetual, because white committed their queen too soon. It's much smarter if we start with this move. So we will first like to see what black will do. Which of the two threats will they use? So if they use the other threat, queen d2, it's not coming with check. So now we have a tempo to play rook f1, and we keep our extra piece, and we're ready to play for an attack. Yeah, you can see rook e2 is not very dangerous, because you can always give check, and beyond your attacking possibilities, you're definitely ruling out black's attack by covering the g2 square. So not so easy for black here after the move king g1. Very precise prophylactic king move. Not easy at all for black. They actually took on f5, and white now played for an attack with queen a6 check. If black goes to b8, we should start with a move rook d1, I think, to threaten mate with rook d8 and queen c8. And when black defends against this threat, now we're ready to play a takes b6. Yeah, why did we include the move rook d1? I think the reason was that if we start with a takes b6, they could play rook e7, if I'm not mistaken. They could play this move. So it's clever from our side to start with rook d1, so that we force the rook to e8, and only then we take on b6 when they cannot defend properly against the check on a7. So in the game after queen a6, Horoshev instead played king d8. Let's see the very nice finish in this game. White played rook d1 after king e7. I think you can imagine white's next move, right? If you think a little about what black has in mind here, prophylactic thinking, that also comes up in the attack actually. We will see that later in chapter 19. The king is trying to escape, so we should avoid that. You're right, queen c8. In this way we threaten mate in 1. The funny thing of course about this is that for a millisecond black might have been thinking that they could take white's queen, but that's not happening of course, because if rook e1, obviously we give check. So yeah, black is lost here. Rook e5, queen d8, and white mates in different ways on the next move. So black actually resigned after queen c8. A nice silent move, preventing the escape of black's king to the king side. So what we have seen here in this example is that white had several ideas, play for an attack and so on, but it was very important for them to first see which path would black choose. Would they take the knight, or would they play queen d2? For that reason, king d1, so that the knight doesn't fall with check, and queen d2 doesn't come with check either. Based on that information, white will then see which path to go. So if black takes the knight, the queen will be far away from the defense of the black king, so white will go for an attack. That's what we saw in the game, the ideas with rook d1 and knight takes b6 and so on. On the other hand, if black instead opts for the other move, if they opt for the other idea, queen d2, unfortunately it doesn't come with check anymore, so we go rook f1. All right, let's take another example where again we are actually better, and we can use this way of thinking to win the game. This is an example that I have used also in exercises and so on. It's very interesting. We are playing with the black pieces in this game with white Navarra and playing black Ivic. You can see that both sides are having some chances for an attack, but mainly black, because black's pieces are much more active. But we should not forget that white has a threat here, queen d8 check. So perhaps the first move that we should check is the move bishop f1. However, in that case, you can see black's idea, of course, chase away the knight so that we could take on h2 with mate. But in that case, obviously, bishop f1 invites queen d8 and queen takes e7 and so on. So what Ivic did here, I'm not sure that he calculated very much. I think he quickly concluded that this was the best path. Since white doesn't have that many things they could do, he started here with the move king g7. So very, very clever, because as you can see, queen d8 is not with a check anymore. So that means that black would take on g2 with mate. So this move, I would say, theoretically speaking, you would start calculating bishop f1 and see what happens and so on. But here we are at move 28. Imagine that you're at move 39, for example. It's very nice if you can make this choice with less limited time on the clock, so to speak. You can make it quickly. And you can actually do that by logical reasoning that, okay, I would love to play this move, but I don't want him to give check. He doesn't have so many other options, so I can play first king g7. That kind of mindset, I think, is very useful, especially when you're in time trouble. So not everything is calculation. Sometimes there are also like general ideas that we can keep in mind. So king g7 was played in the game. I think Navarra played queen b7. So that, yeah, he played queen b7 so that he's again attacking the pawn on e7, while at the same time keeping track of the knight on g2. So what do you think? What should black play now? How to face the threat of queen takes e7? That's completely right. We already know about this topic very well, so we will do it again. King h6, exactly, so that if white takes, we have the same situation. Again, white loses flexibility, and black can then mate white. The queen loses flexibility. So difficult for white this position. If white plays rook g1, trying to safeguard the knight, black could play something like rook e2 with the deadly threat of bishop e4. So in the game after king h6, white played h4, giving the king some extra space. Black carried out finally their idea, bishop f1. As you can see now, material losses are unavoidable for white. g5 wouldn't make sense. Maybe you can take it, but much safer, of course, just move the king so that they don't have any more checks. So after bishop f1, Navarra gave up the exchange, rook takes f1. After queen takes f1, king h2. I think there were multiple ways to win this, but the way in which Ivic continued was very straightforward. Queen f2. Now you can see the pawn is hanging on h4, the hidden pin, so to speak. White played g5, and as we talked about, we could take on h5, g5, but it's actually more practical not to do it. King h5 happening in the game, avoiding any checking scenarios. Queen e4, and the last move in the game, try to deflect the queen. Aha, f5, very nice, because now we can take on h4. Next turn, the queen doesn't have a good square in this position. It must also keep track of the knight on g2. So actually, a rather simple example, even if it is technical, complex, long variations. If you, for example, opt for bishop f1, I can assure you that variations get complex here. But let's stick to a more practical approach. If we play king g7, we avoid all that calculation. That's very pleasant, of course, in time travel, for example. King g7, so that they don't give check, and after queen b7, we do it again. King h6, again, they cannot give check, and now they cannot really get at our king, so we are ready to play bishop f1 next turn. Very clever attack by Ivic. And then I would like to show you two examples from the endgame, because this kind of thinking, it also applies in the endgame. In our first example, we are in trouble. Playing with the white pieces is Kühlhaus, and playing black is Milton Panzer. You can see that white is in trouble here, despite the fact that they're a pawn up. Black is much better coordinated. You can see that there is a threat of h takes d2. We have to do something about these pawns. So what do you think? There are two obvious candidate moves here, right? You could take, or you could play g3. Which one would you prefer to play here with white? Which one do you think would be the least of evils, so to speak? Yeah, certainly not an easy question to answer like that. I have seen a few times that if you can get away with taking the pawn, it's better in the long run, because if you let them keep that pawn, I mean now in general terms, not about this position, but in general, if you let them keep that pawn, it will be a headache in the long run, such an advanced h-pawn on h3, very often with white, you see it on h6 and so on. So if you can get away with it, taking that pawn, it's usually worth it to suffer a little, but to get it off the board. And it applies a little to this game, because in the game, unfortunately, Kühlhaus played g3. You can imagine black's next move here, right? Of course, knight g4. Black is actually going for mate here. They're trying to queen that h-pawn and so on. White played knight f7. I think what white noticed was that if black takes, we will have king g1, rook g2, and king f1. And white will save their skin here because they have the mating threat. But we talked a little about the back rank motive in chapter 4. And here you have another example. If you look carefully, you can see that white's king is actually exposed to a back rank motive. The rook is the piece which is currently looking after the back rank, and that explains black's next move in the game. Of course, very nice move by Panzer. Rook takes f5. In this way, black wins the game. White cannot take back, because in that case they are getting mated, and the check on h8 doesn't make a big difference. We can just play king g6. So that's what happened in the game. Yeah, terrible for white. What they should have done instead, they should have taken on h3. And after rook takes h3, you might ask yourself, what does this have to do with the chapter about the king move? Well, here you have the answer. Of course, Kühlhaus saw this position, but he didn't like it, because he noticed that the pawn will fall in any situation here. It's impossible for white to save that pawn. We have no piece like a bishop we could defend it and so on. So it's going to fall. But the question is how to give it away. This pawn, in which would be the best way to lose this pawn. And that's of course connected to our topic here. If we try to mate them again, the same idea with knight f7, now black would take with h rook, so that they can give mate with the other rook next turn, the typical mating picture. So you can see actually here black has some kind of choice. They are sometimes preferring to take with the h rook, especially if they can give mate, of course, but they could also sometimes consider to take with the other rook, with the a rook. So it depends a little. What white could try to do here, of course, they could make space for the king, moving the king to c1, rook fc1, so that they don't get mated anymore. But still, this would be painful for white, because after rook takes king g1, the knight will join the battle here. I think we give one more check, rook ag2, and after king f1, we should just bring the knight to the battle. I think this is one idea, but if I'm not mistaken, that's even stronger. Knight h5 is even stronger, yeah, because we have the double idea of knight g3 with mate, and the other idea is to play knight f4, protecting the rook so that we can give mate with rook h1. This is what is awaiting white. If they move away the rook from the f file, you can see that black immediately takes advantage of the fact that white's rook left the f file. So in this position, you can see that both knight f7 and rook fc1, they are not working. But I mean, this is very basic, but I still want to say it. If we know that black will take the pawn next turn, if we know that this pawn is going to fall next turn, and we will have to move the king, why not do it right now? So one way or another, it should provide us some extra flexibility, right? So, of course, we start with king g1. Now let's see if we can understand this together. If black takes with the a rook, well, that means that mate is not a threat right now for white, I mean, so we can play knight f7. We go for our mate. And it's not easy to see how black should prevent this in a good way. They can always make a draw here, give checks like that, but it's hard for them to get anything more. I think I looked at, what did I look at here? Rook check here. Aha, we should not step on f3, so we go to g3 instead, and they can give check again, and we can play something like that. Aha, interesting variation. No, interesting variation. Something like that. And it seems black has some problems to solve here still. There is the concrete threat of rook h8, mate, and also skewering idea, right? And rook e2, we will just play king d3. So yeah, white would probably make a draw here at least in this situation, because we're hitting the rook also. On the other hand, after king g1, after a flexible move king g1, if they take with the h rook, now of course we cannot go for mate anymore, because then we are mated. But now we have a move which we didn't have last time. Let's see if we can understand this correctly. If we have this position, we would like to play a move which makes them take on h2, so to speak. Or maybe I expressed myself in the wrong way. Yeah, I probably expressed myself in a bad way. So king g1, they take on h2, and now there is a move which we didn't have in the previous position. So the hint for you would be that in the other variation that we saw, if you remember, the knight came to h5 in the very end. It wanted to go to g3, and it wanted to go to f4, if you remember that variation. Or should we look at it? Yeah, we can look at it, of course, after rook takes h3. If we play rook fc1 here, immediately trying to activate the rook, well, we were saying that black will take on h2, and after king g1, rook ag2 check, king f1, black will have this killer move, knight h5. So the point of knight h5 is to play knight g3 or knight f4, okay? Now we have that piece of information. So now back to the main line here. We play king g1, and if they take on h2, since we know that the knight would like to settle on one of these two squares, how can we fight against this plan? Don't forget that they're about to mate us, so you know which piece you should move here probably. That's right. Rook f3. This is the move that we didn't have previously, right? We didn't have it in this position because the rook is still there. It's like, if you remember the first example that we saw the game Lenderman versus you, right? So Lenderman played king g1, and if you then played queen h6, the pawn on e5 was lost. But white couldn't take the pawn in the first place because it was defended, right? So we have to play out the king move first, and after that we have greater flexibility, something like that. So we play king g1 here, and since they commit their rook to h2, now we can play this defensive move, rook f3. That's how it works. So now it's not so easy for black anymore. They can play in the same way. They can give the check, and after king f1, as you can see, knight h5, it's not the same thing anymore. What would you play here? That's right, we can play knight f7, and since we have the rook here, I think this is even very dangerous for black, right? Knight g3, we will just take it, and we're actually mating them on h8. Yeah, correct me if I missed something here, but this is what I think the big implication of this move, rook f3. It's taking care of this very important square on g3. So black would have to play something else here. Rook d2 comes to mind. Black has 3 threats here, no? 1, 2, and 3. However, there is a simple solution against all those threats. Anyone who has been haunted by 2 rooks on the penultimate rank knows what you do in this kind of situation. Of course, we just go back with the king. We annoy them a little so that they can't mate us, right? So king g1, and black cannot really progress in this position, believe it or not. The rook is very, very well placed here on h3, and I think, yeah, black should even be a little careful, right? Not to miss something like rook h3 at some point. So very complex example, and what we can learn from this example, perhaps, one, very careful with letting the opponent keep such an advanced rook pawn. They are usually very powerful. And two, if you arrive at this kind of position where you notice that they will check us anyway, we are going to be checked anyway, then perhaps why don't we just move the king in advance, so to speak? Because that will most likely give us greater flexibility. And next turn we will see their cards and we will know which cards to play ourselves, such as in this case, waiting for black to leave the third rank, and then we can put our rook on that place for defensive purposes. All right, this is an example where white was suffering, but I would like to show you also an example where actually we were better and we used this idea in order to win the game, because that's what happened in our last example, playing with white pieces Akopian and with the black pieces Pragnananda. You can see that at this point material is about equal, but black is more active. Evidently black is more active. In a normal situation here, black would just play knight h3 and take the rook on f1. However, as you can see, that cannot be done because there is a back rank motive here, right? Rook b8. So black needs to do something about this threat, or this motive, you could say, of mate on the first rank. So we had this just in the previous chapter, right? We talked about which pawn to move and so on to free a square for the king, right? That's what we were talking about. So if we delve a little further into these variations, if we start, let's say, we can look at g6, for example. What's the problem with this? It looks very convincing, no? Because we have knight h3 coming up next turn. If white moves away the rook somewhere, well, maybe we could give check and bring in the other rook or things like that. I think also there is knight g4, maybe, if rook here, maybe there is a move like knight g4. I think this is a good move also. Yeah, very annoying for white, this position for sure, because their king is in danger and their pawns are weak, and the knight on g2 is dominated by black's knight. No? So this is not the problem for black. The problem is that white can actually simplify this position. Can you see like a hidden possibility for white here? How could they simplify into a rook endgame? You're completely right. Surprise move here, knight f4. What's going on? Well, if black takes, white takes, you don't even calculate variations here, you just know that if we reach a rook endgame, we're on the safer side, and the pawns are falling off also here. You can see rook takes, king takes, and so on. White has no problems. And if you move the knight somewhere, obviously, let's say knight e4, then there is an even bigger problem here, because white will then play knight takes g6, and the rook is falling on f8, unfortunately. But of course, Pragnananda, he saw through this plan, he saw through this idea, and he knew that there is one way of avoiding the back rank motive, which is much better than the rest. So, having seen this resource with white, this temporary sacrifice, what do you think black should play? Aha, not completely intuitive, but very obvious once you have like delved into the variations. King g8, of course. Now, if white carries out the same idea, knight f4, we can safely put our knight on e4, and there is no discovered attack anymore. And at the same time, you can see that white's position is crumbling here. All the pawns are weak and so on. So very clever play by Pragnananda. That's actually how the game went. Here, Akopian intended knight e6, however, after rook takes f1, king takes f1, knight takes g3, king e1, rook takes a4, white's position collapsed and black went on to win. So what you have seen here in this complex example is that there was like a little secret in the position. This topic of secrets, we will come to it later. I think it is in chapter 16, if I'm not mistaken. We discover some little piece of information that we can use. We discover it in one variation, and then we can use it in another variation. So what most of us probably would look at here with black is a move like g6 or h6 in order to give the king a square. But in that case, white would have this very nice defensive trick, knight f4, in order to simplify the position. No? Pawn takes, rook takes, and the knight could not move, because in that case, white has the discovered attack. So for that reason, once Pragnananda noticed this motive or this idea from his opponent, he played here the simple move king g8. And it was already very difficult to save white in this position. Simply black counter the check in advance, so to speak, even if it's not even close, this check. So yeah, very nice thinking by the young Indian star. All right, let's do a quick recap of the examples that we have seen here. Let's start with our first example. We saw in this initial simple example that black was about to play queen h6, so we play king g1 to see black's cards. If they now play queen h6, it's not a check, so they will drop the pawn. So for that reason, makes perfect sense to start with the king move for the sake of flexibility. In the second example, we saw that rook g7 was coming up. Black's smartest defense here to move away the king in advance, so that we also obtain greater flexibility next turn, such as, for example, freeing our rook along the c-file. In the following example, this was a very, very complex example. We said that king h1 is best here because our defensive choices here, they depend greatly on what black will do next. So it's good to have the knight on c3, for example, so that if e4 we can take with the knight instead of taking with the pawn. And we would only play this move knight a4 if black actually puts a bishop tab. Then we would play the move knight a4. So very good choice here, king h1. Waiting a little to see the opponent's next step. We saw in a favorable situation here, white was playing for a win. They noticed a double threat of queen d2 and queen takes f5, and they decided to play king g1 so that they could see which of these two paths black would choose, and based on that they would take actions here. For example, if black takes, then white will go for an attack, since in that case the d-file is now available for the attack. We saw in the game Navarra-Ivic that both sides were attacking, but white was only attacking with the queen, so it was easier for black to escape this attack. But it made perfect sense, since white queen is doing like two things at the same time. It made perfect sense to first commit our king, so that they cannot play queen d8 with the check anymore, because in that case they will get mated. And if they play queen b7 hanging on to this idea, we could repeat our idea also, move away the king in advance, so that the capture on e7 won't come with check. In that case, we would give mate. So now we're finally ready for our own attack, and that's what happened in the game. We saw in the two endgame examples, first in the difficult endgame, we saw that after h3, white should take on h3 and play the flexible move king g1, waiting a little bit further actions until they see how black takes on h2, which rook they use for that purpose. In the last example, Pragananda had an advantage, but he had to envisage this defensive trick. For that reason, he played here the clever move king g8. Now there are no back rank motives, so there is the threat of knight h3 and rook takes f1. And white has no real good way of countering this threat anymore, because after knight f4 there is knight e4, and unfortunately for white, knight g6 doesn't come with check, since the king has already moved. All right, thanks a lot, and see you in the next chapter.